So let's dive into a headline that seems to pop up again and again in the long, complicated conflict between Turkey and the PKK. It's a warning, really a threat, that you hear almost every time peace talks get serious. The peace process can collapse. You've probably seen this exact quote, or something very close to it, right? Senior figures from the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, or its allies will come out with this stark warning. If Ankara doesn't give us what we want, this whole fragile thing could just shatter. It's a classic move, and it's all about creating leverage.
But that leads us to the big question we're digging into today. Is that threat still credible? It's not just about the words anymore. It's about what can actually be done on the ground. And as we're going to see, there's this massive widening gap between the talk of war and the reality of the fight.
Okay, so first, let's just unpack these warnings, because this isn't some vague threat. No, it's a pretty coordinated message coming from several key figures, and it's all designed to put the pressure squarely on the Turkish government. And you can see how it's all layered. You got the PKK's executive committee setting these really hard lines. No progress without freedom for their jailed leader, Abdullah Öcalan, and they want constitutional rights for Kurds. Then you have Salih's Muslim from the Syrian PYD linking the peace process inside Turkey to what Ankara is doing over in Syria. And finally, Öcalan himself sends a message, warning that failure could bring back crisis politics. So the public message, the framing of it all, is crystal clear. The PKK holds the keys. They're saying, we can either unlock the door to peace if you meet our demands, or we can unleash a whole lot of chaos if you don't. But does that story actually line up with the facts on the ground? And this right here is the heart of the matter. Because over the last 10 years or so, and especially since 2019, Turkey has rolled out a military strategy that has completely, and I mean completely, changed the game. Turkey's new approach hits from multiple angles, and it has systematically squeezed the PKK's ability to operate. First, there's constant drone surveillance. We're talking eyes in the sky 24/7, making it almost impossible for fighters to move around without being seen. Second, they've built this network of fortified outposts called calicols that basically control all the key terrain, boxing fighters in. And third, Turkey now uses what they call low-cost persistent air power to hit PKK targets deep inside Iraq and Syria. And the result of all this is pretty stark. Look, the PKK hasn't been totally defeated, not at all. But its ability to fight has been seriously worn down. It can still pull off these symbolic attacks that grab headlines, for sure. But it just can't sustain the kind of big, strategic military campaign that would be needed to actually force Ankara to the negotiating table. So, if the battlefield has changed that much, what does the data tell us about this imbalance of power? Let's actually look at the numbers for a second. This just lays that gap out in plain terms, doesn't it? On one side, you have these huge, sweeping warnings that make it sound like we could go back to the really intense fighting of the 1990s. But on the other side, you've got the reality on the ground, a military capacity that's really just limited to smaller one-off attacks. The two, they just don't match up. Now, I want you to just look at this number, 21-1. What in the world could that possibly represent in this conflict? Well, here's what it means. Based on 2024 data from ACLED, that's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, for every one attack the PKK launched against Turkey, Turkey hit back with more than 21 strikes of its own. That is the brutal reality of the military imbalance right now. It's an overwhelming amount of force that Turkey can bring down whenever it wants. So the bottom line is this. When your ability to dish out damage is just a fraction of the damage you're taking, your threats to collapse the process, well, they start to ring pretty hollow. That is a very, very weak foundation to build leverage on. But the fallout from this gap between words and reality, it doesn't stop at Turkey's borders. And this is where the story gets even more complicated, because these threats have a very real and often devastating cost for the Kurdish groups over in Syria. You have to understand the geography here. It's critical. The PKK's classic hideout in the Kandil Mountains in Iraq, it's super rugged, perfect for guerrilla fighters to disappear. Northeast Syria, on the other hand, is mostly wide open plains. That kind of terrain is way more exposed and way more vulnerable to the exact drones and surveillance that Turkey is now so good at using. The strategic risk is just so much higher. So you see what happens, right? When the PKK makes these threats against Turkey, it has a direct negative effect on Syrian Kurds. It hands Ankara the perfect excuse to paint the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, as just another part of a terrorist group. This is what experts call securitization. It's when you take a political issue, like Kurdish autonomy in Syria, and you turn it into a national security threat. And that makes any kind of political solution so much harder to reach. And here's the detail that often gets lost in all the noise. The SDF is not just a Kurdish force. Not at all. In fact, a huge portion of its fighters are Arabs. So when the PKK's rhetoric takes over the whole conversation, it doesn't just damage the SDF's reputation internationally, it can also start to create real tensions inside this very multi-ethnic coalition.
Okay, so if military threats don't really have the same teeth they used to, what does a real path to peace even look like now? What's left?
This quote from the source material it really hits the nail on the head. The old playbook of using the threat of war to get to the negotiating table is basically broken because one side's ability to actually wage that war has fundamentally changed. A peace that's actually going to last, if it's going to happen, will be built on these things. This is the hard, slow, grinding work of politics and law. Making sure people have real representation, guaranteeing rights for all citizens, and creating ways to bring former fighters back into society. This is the stuff that actually builds trust, not threats.
And for the Kurdish groups in Syria, the ones operating in that much more fragile and exposed situation we talked about, the takeaway is crystal clear. The strategic priority for them should be to create distance, to de-link their political future from the conflict inside Turkey, so they can stop giving Ankara an easy excuse to treat them like a security threat.
So, I'll leave you with this final thought. In this new reality where the gap between words and war has gotten so incredibly wide, whose words are now the biggest obstacle to finding a different way forward?